the number of people betting on sports has doubled in the past 5 years, and 10% of sports bettors are classified at risk of problem gambling. Now, Mr Speaker, we know that this is unacceptable, and that's why we need reform, and that's why we need to get reform right to deliver both harm reduction and cultural change.
Well, that was the Communications Minister, Michelle Rowland, there, laying out the problem when it comes to gambling ads. And anyone who's watched sport on TV will know these ads are pervasive, and they're often targeted at young men with the constant message that betting on the footy, betting on the cricket, betting on pretty much anything is just what normal blokes do. But the rise in problem gambling and the devastating impact this can have on families means the government is now under pressure to act. And on the other side, the TV industry, the sporting codes, the gambling industry itself is warning about going too far here. Media companies in particular say they need this revenue to survive. So the question now is, what will the government do? There's a strong push from the crossbench in Parliament and even from some within Labor for a complete ban on gambling ads. That was the recommendation of a parliamentary committee led by the late Labor MP Peter Murphy, which reached a rare bipartisan consensus. But it doesn't look like that's where the government will land. So what's at stake here? Will some greater regulation at least make some difference? And why are gambling ads so effective? I'm David Speers on Ngunnawal Country at Parliament House in Canberra. Welcome to Insiders on Background. Well, Martin Thomas is the CEO of the Alliance for Gambling Reform. Great to talk to you. Thanks for joining us.
Thanks for having me on, David.
So, Martin, before we get to what the government will or should do, I'm keen to just get a better understanding of what is actually happening right now. We heard the Minister there talking about this doubling in sports betting over the past 5 years in Australia. It's really taken off. Why and what harm is that causing?
Well, the harm is devastating across the community. I mean, we know that Australians lose $25 billion. We've been talking about that for a long time, annually, more than any other country in the world.
Is that all gambling, or is
that's
that just
all gambling?
So
yeah.
pokies?
But that's losses.
Right.
So that's not just the amount of money that's spent; that's losses.
What about sports betting as a component of
sports
that?
betting. Sports betting is the fastest growing component. So it's not the largest yet,
right,
but it's catching up. And what is interesting is what we don't know quite as much is that if you rip $25 billion out of the community, particularly at a cost of living crisis, you cause industrial social harm, essentially. And we know it causes financial loss, that's obvious. We know it also causes mental health issues. The research shows that if you have a gambler in the family with a problem, 3 times more likely to have domestic violence. And there's some report that says even as many as 20% or as much as 20% of suicides in Australia are linked to gambling, except we don't collect the data here to confirm it. They collect it in Hong Kong, and that's the finding there, and they believe we'd probably be more.
And again, when we look at the sports betting component of that, because that's what's being debated here in Parliament now, is the advertising around sports betting. Is there evidence, any data to show what impact that is having on these social problems?
Well, it is, and the figures you quoted around the number of young people. So the fastest growing category is at 18 to 25. What's ironic, I guess, is the researchers didn't cover anyone under 18, so we just don't have any vision of it. But we know anecdotally young people are really betting at a large level and getting hooked. And
setting up false accounts.
Exactly, getting around the measures. And and also what we're finding is, even from a very young age, the gamification of gambling, even in games like Candy Crush and others, where you have loot boxes and you either pay real currency or in-game currency, it's almost fostering a whole culture. And to answer your question, what really is at stake is this next generation. We've been talking about the harm poker machines do, and that's largely an older generation. We are really, with sports betting, looking at an industry that is particularly targeting young people and, in effect, creating a whole new generation of gamblers.
And I mentioned young men in particular when it comes to sports betting. It's you can see it in all the ads. Why are young men being targeted? Why are they, I guess, susceptible to this sort of advertising.
Well, and the advertising's very clever. Bet with mates, back yourself, all these kind of phrases allow it to become a peer issue, and embedding itself with sport, particularly our biggest sporting codes, makes it cool. Just like tobacco in the 70s, I had Benson and Hedges posters for the cricket, and we used to have Rothmans for the NRL. It makes it cool. Now, I wasn't cool enough to smoke, but I know many of my peers that had a cachet, and certainly it led to smoking levels for amongst young people being really high until advertising was banned. And I think...
So it's really about normalising, in this instance.
It is.
That to have mates, to be a normal young man...
Yep.
You need to bet when you're watching the footy.
Well, and it's part of the game. If you are 13 years or younger, you've never seen a sporting contest without gambling ads.
Wow.
So it's quite
right?
Incredible and pervasive.
Yeah.
So, yeah, I think that's it. I think the other thing is that's what we can see. There was a recent study by FAIR, which is the Foundation for Alcohol Research, and it looked at the social media screens of young people and found kids as young as 14 were getting gambling ads in their feed, encouraging them to download gambling ads. So there's also a subterranean, quite cynical, quite predatory advertising pitch from the industry.
So look, let's look at some of the arguments that the industry puts forward here. One is that if you restrict advertising, their ability to advertise, more people are going to just bet on illegal offshore sites. What do you say to that? I mean, the Prime Minister's even been making that argument as well.
Well, look, we're not against gambling. People should be able to gamble. It's a free society.
So you're not after a complete ban on gambling?
No, exactly. We're the Alliance for Gambling Reform, and the reform we want is advertising. And given we get 1 million ads just on free-to-air TV and radio every year, I think we know about the various sites enough by now, and what it's actually doing is pulling in younger people to bet, and also people who are trying to give up gambling. It becomes a trigger, and we know that most of the income from gambling industry comes from problem gamblers, something like 30-40% they rely on from 10% of gamblers. So the gambling industry doesn't want to play fair. They are not just after someone doing 1 or 2 bets. They want people to bet to oblivion. They want as many people to bet as all their money and even more. And that's why we get these harrowing stories of people not only losing their house, their super, inheritances, racking up $30,000 a time on credit cards that they can't pay.
Well, in fairness, the industry, I suspect, would dispute that they want people to reach that point. They say they're happy to have some level of restriction, whether it's caps on the number of ads and so on. But they argue that we've already got about 15% of gambling happening on illegal offshore sites, and they point to other countries where they say over-regulate, more people will go to those sites.
Yeah. Look, and we understand from a government point of view, it is a difficult issue. We understand networks are under pressure. But if we took that to a logical conclusion, we'd say let's bring back tobacco advertising because that was worth a lot of money to the networks. This is really about a legal product that's an adult product that does harm, and we really need to regulate it to protect people. And really the government's choice now is to protect Australians and to versus those vested interests.
Is this as bad as tobacco? Because again, the industry and indeed some cabinet ministers have been publicly arguing this week it's different. It's not as bad for your health. What do you say to that?
Well, we say the social damage is enormous. I mean, we looked at those figures earlier around suicide and mental health. It is just changes people's lives and destroys people's lives. Now, let's just say 10% for argument's sake of people are problem gamblers. That means that's a husband or a wife or a child. That means parents are involved. That means the extended family are all impacted. I spoke to a lady the other day whose husband started gambling in the COVID lockdown and then died recently. And she is now having to unfold the estate where he's had 4 to 5 credit cards, all with $30,000 debt on them from gambling. She's at risk of losing her house. So her 5 children that she's trying to raise are all battling with us. So there is a core of people that I guess are problematic in terms of trying to stop, which I mean, you mentioned the industry says they don't want people to gamble irresponsibly. One of the recommendations is also to stop the incentives that happen. So as soon as you stop gambling, you'll get a friendly text from your betting agency saying, here's a free spin or a free gamble. And in some cases, we've had people who have written to gambling organisations saying, I'm on the point of suicide, please take me off. Don't message me anymore. And they respond with a free bet.
Look, those stories are absolutely heartbreaking, but to use the number you cited there, 10%, if 10% are problem gamblers, does that mean the majority aren't, that they're totally fine and happy to be having a flutter?
Well, look, we don't think so. One of the big challenges in gambling is that the government hasn't funded any research. They fund research on alcohol, tobacco. They treat it as a public health issue. No one funds gambling except the gambling industry. So we don't really have a great picture of it. But we know anecdotally that the impact is devastating on individuals. As we said, that 10% has an echo factor. But I think also if you, again, rip $25 billion out of local communities, and particularly in areas where they're doing it tough, that has a profound impact across the community. And it has an impact on hospital spending. It has an impact on policing. We know from, in the broad sense of gambling, the New South Wales Crime Commission talked about poker machines and the billions of dollars being fed in by organised crime.
The argument that we've heard quite a few ministers mounting this week is about protecting the TV networks, particularly regional TV networks. They are under pressure. I don't think anyone can dispute that with the rise of big social media platforms and so on. How do you feel about that argument?
Look, we feel that the government can make this a bit easier for the networks. We're not wanting the networks to fold. The ban that's been recommendation is a 3-year phased-in approach, so it's not going to happen overnight. We'd be open to, I mean, we don't control the government books, but we'd be open to potentially some compensation as a transition into this process.
From the government, like a taxpayer-funded.
And if you think of what happened with tobacco, state government set up foundations that went in and took over the sponsorship from tobacco of local clubs and others. So there are mechanisms that have happened before. It really feels like we're still living in the 70s. It feels like with tobacco, now we would be shocked if we saw wall-to-wall tobacco advertising. We know it's bad for your health. We know the industry lied about the links to cancer. I just think we're going to wake up in 10 or 20 years and look back on this and say, why was it so hard?
I mean, how do we compare to other countries in Australia? Sports betting ads are pretty prevalent here.
Yeah.
What about elsewhere?
Yeah, well, look, they have been banned in a couple of European countries, and the ceiling didn't fall down on the local media.
I mean, the industry says in those countries, Italy, Spain, I think the Netherlands, that there was a shift to more offshore illegal sites. Although I think the Spanish gambling regulator said, well, that didn't actually happen. So that's contested.
Yeah, exactly. But look, I think, again, we're not talking about stopping gambling. I think the Murphy report, amongst its 31 recommendations, talks about cracking down on illegal sites. And I think the government certainly needs to do that. Now, we understand that's not easy. It's a little bit like a whack-a-mole, that as soon as you hit one, another one pops up. But it doesn't mean that you abandon good public policy and public health policy because there's a chance that someone may use an illegal site.
So let's look at what the government is doing, where it's going to land on all of this. It's not all out there publicly. We're kind of getting hints and drips and bits and pieces. Maybe next week this will go to Cabinet, it looks like, and we'll see a bit more detail. Do you know what's actually going on behind the scenes?
No, we have no idea.
Right, okay.
Look, and it's funny. We feel like we are being public and transparent in what we're calling for, but we feel like we're one person in a boxing ring because the other side is dealing very untransparently and just having secret meetings at different times over the period.
So the media companies, sporting codes and the gambling industry are all being consulted, but they have to sign these non-disclosure agreements.
Absolutely.
So they can't reveal too much either.
But even before then, I mean, we've had this debate for the last 12 months and even during the Murphy inquiry, and there's not many times I've had a counterpart from the gambling industry or even the media industry happening to have a debate. It just isn't happening.
So will you get a briefing on this?
So it looks like we'll get a briefing this week, a trimmed-down briefing,
Right.
and we've agreed to do it on the basis that we'll treat it confidentially.
So you'll agree to an NDA as well?
No, well, we won't, and that's what we
okay.
said. We can't assess an NDA. We're just a small organisation. We don't want to have all the legal costs, and even then, even if we don't breach it, we can be accused of breaching it, and that ties us up in knots.
So how does that work? You get a briefing, but you agree.
So it's a
You
bit,
basically
bit more
say,
Queensberry rules again, I think. So
Right.
I don't think they'll give us anything commercial in confidence, is what they've said.
Right.
Not really sure what that means in some context, but
So
we'll get a briefing.
Presumably the value of the advertising to the networks,
Well,
you won't get told the dollars
I think
and
that's
cents.
correct.
Okay.
Yeah, we'll get told a little bit because they want our feedback, which we're very happy to give, and we're happy to give it now as well as face to face. And we've promised, look, anything that's confidential we'll keep confidential, but anything that's in the public domain, or we hear from other sources in the public domain, we want to be able to bring to the Australian public's attention.
So what are you hearing? Before you get this briefing, what are you hearing in the public domain? Where do you think this is going to land?
Look, we're hearing that there will be some reforms, and obviously that's terrific. Any change will be terrific. Now, we did initially hear that there'll be a ban on social platforms. We weren't sure how extensive that is, and even then there's been reports that they're going to walk that back because
so
there was
the Financial
a lot
Review
of
reported
outrage.
that Google search results will still show gambling ads.
Yeah.
What do you think about that?
Well, I think any change is better than what we have, but this is really a once-in-a-generation moment that if we get it right now, we set ourselves on a path that's much better than if we do it half-baked. Obviously, the feeling seems to be they aren't going with the full gambling ban, and that seems, I guess, of all the 31 recommendations in the Murphy report, seems to be the barometer or the litmus test about how serious they are.
So from all the reports, it'll be a limit of 2 ads per hour, no ads for an hour or an hour after a live sporting event. As you say, the largely banned on social media or online, but it looks like there'll be some exemptions. So if this is where it all lands, you're saying that will make a difference though?
Well, look, I think certainly the social media side of it will, if it's comprehensive. Now, when someone says social media, we're not sure if we're just talking Facebook or if we're talking internet platforms as well. And, I'm assuming people go to the AFL site, they'll still see betting odds under what the government's proposing. So we don't really know. There is some other recommendations which there's been no indication of at all. One of them is to actually have a levy on the industry to help fund better public education. There's a recommendation to have a national gambling regulator. So uniformity in this area would be fantastic as well, obviously.
Because it's all at the moment state by state
it
and
is,
territory
and
by
depending,
territory.
yeah. And what happens is all the sports betting companies are registered in the Northern Territory.
Right.
They're foreign owned.
Is that because the rules are a bit easier there?
And it's cheaper in terms of the licensing fees. So essentially the Northern Territory has become the bargain basement default national regulator in terms of these
And what
companies.
are you hearing on this? Will there be a national regulator?
Well, we heard nothing.
Okay.
Nothing at all.
All right. Well, it'll be interesting. You can't talk after your briefing on Friday, but hopefully we find out not too far after that. So look, just finally, you're not pursuing a complete ban on gambling. You'd love to see a ban on gambling advertising. It doesn't look like it'll go that far, but are you satisfied there will be progress here?
We simply don't know. I think the government is, because the government's delayed so long, it's been more than, 14 months now. We are now heading towards a poll early next year. I think the government's made it harder than they should have by delaying for so long. This is inherently, I think, a political decision around political survival versus the good of the public.
Martin Thomas from the Alliance for Gambling Reform, thanks so much for joining us.
Thanks for your time.
And if you've got any feedback on this conversation or suggestions for future podcasts, please drop us a line, insiders@abc.net.au. We will be talking about this more on Sunday morning on The Couch. Hope you can join us then. Bye for now.